I never expected one random comment from a group of strangers to turn into a moment I would remember for years. It was supposed to be one of the happiest evenings my husband and I had shared in a long time. It was our anniversary, and after everything we had been through together, we were looking forward to a quiet dinner, good food, and a chance to celebrate another year of marriage. What started as an ordinary wait at a bar ended with an entire table of people learning a lesson they weren't expecting. A lesson about assumptions, judgment, and how little we really know about the strangers sitting beside us. A year earlier, my life had looked completely different. I had undergone a double mastectomy after discovering I carried a hereditary breast cancer gene. The diagnosis itself was terrifying, but the decisions that followed were even harder. I had to choose between living in constant fear of cancer or taking drastic preventative measures. It wasn't a choice anyone dreams of making. There were tears, sleepless nights, endless doctor appointments, and more anxiety than I can put into words. Eventually, I chose surgery. The operation saved me from years of worry, but it also changed my body forever. Recovery wasn't easy. Physically, I healed faster than I expected, but emotionally it took much longer. Looking in the mirror became complicated. Some days I felt strong and proud. Other days I barely recognized myself. After reconstruction surgery, my new breasts looked nothing like natural breasts. They were still settling, still healing, still adjusting. To me, they looked strange. Too round. Too firm. Too perfect in a way that real bodies rarely are. But I was learning to accept them because they represented survival. They represented another chance at life. Fast forward to our anniversary night. I had spent extra time getting ready because I wanted to feel beautiful again. Not for strangers. Not for social media. Not for attention. Just for me and for my husband. I chose a slightly low-cut blouse, something I normally wouldn't wear. It felt like a small victory. For the first time in months, I looked in the mirror and thought maybe I looked good. Maybe I looked confident. Maybe I looked like myself again. I arrived at the restaurant a little early, and since my husband was running behind, I grabbed a seat at the bar to wait. The place was lively, filled with conversations, laughter, and the usual weekend energy. I ordered a drink and checked my phone. Everything felt normal. Then I started hearing voices from the table beside me. At first, I ignored them. They were obviously drinking heavily and speaking much louder than they probably realized. But eventually, certain words started standing out. Words like fake, plastic, artificial, attention-seeking. I glanced over and realized they were talking about women's bodies. Specifically, breast implants. One woman rolled her eyes and announced that she couldn't stand women with fake breasts. Another person at the table laughed and agreed. Then someone else joined in. Before long, it had become a full group discussion. They criticized women who had cosmetic surgery. They mocked their appearance. They questioned their character. They called them insecure, fake, desperate. One man even joked that he could always tell because they looked unnatural. The table erupted in laughter. I sat there frozen. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was being overly sensitive. But then I realized something that made my stomach drop. They weren't just talking generally. They kept glancing in my direction. Their eyes would drift toward me, then back to their drinks, followed by another round of comments and laughter. Suddenly, I became painfully aware of my blouse. A blouse I had worn because I finally felt confident enough to wear it. A blouse I now regretted putting on. For several minutes, I tried to ignore them. I focused on my drink. I checked messages on my phone. I looked toward the entrance, hoping my husband would arrive soon. But the comments kept coming. Every joke seemed louder than the last. Every laugh seemed directed straight at me. What frustrated me most wasn't the insult itself. It was the certainty with which they spoke. They acted as though they knew everything. As though they could look at a person for 2 seconds and understand their entire story. They had no idea who I was. They had no idea what I had survived. They had no idea how much courage it had taken just to wear that blouse. Eventually, I reached a point where I simply couldn't stay silent anymore. I turned around on my stool and looked directly at them. The laughter stopped almost instantly. It's amazing how quickly people get quiet when the person they're talking about suddenly joins the conversation. I smiled politely and said, "Can I ask you all something?" They looked confused but nodded. Then I said, "You know what I hate more than fake breasts?" The entire table fell silent. A few people exchanged awkward glances. I could see them waiting for the punchline. Waiting for some sarcastic comeback. Waiting for an argument. Instead, I looked each of them in the eye and said, "Breast cancer." You could have heard a pin drop. The silence was immediate and absolute. Every smile disappeared. Every laugh vanished. Suddenly nobody seemed interested in continuing the conversation. I let the words sit there for a moment before adding, "A year ago I had a double mastectomy. These aren't fake because I wanted attention. They're reconstructed because I wanted to stay alive." No one spoke. One woman stared at her drink. Another looked down at the floor. A man who had been laughing the loudest suddenly seemed fascinated by the coaster under his glass. Finally, someone muttered, "Oh, wow." Another person quietly said, "I'm sorry." It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting. No big confrontation. No scene. Just a group of people realizing that the stranger they had judged had a story they never bothered to imagine. Within minutes, they paid their bill and left. As they walked out, a few offered awkward apologies. I accepted them and let it go. There wasn't much else to say. Shortly after that, my husband arrived. He immediately noticed something was different and asked what had happened. I told him the whole story. By the end, he was shaking his head in disbelief. Then he laughed and said, "Well, I bet they won't be making those comments again anytime soon." We ended up laughing together, not because the situation was funny, but because sometimes laughter is the best response after surviving something difficult. The rest of the evening was wonderful. We enjoyed our dinner, celebrated our anniversary, and talked about everything except cancer. But that moment stayed with me. Not because people were rude. Unfortunately, rude people exist everywhere. What stayed with me was how quickly assumptions can fall apart when the truth finally appears. The people at that table thought they knew exactly what kind of person I was. They built an entire story about me based on a few seconds of observation. They were completely wrong. And that's the lesson I wish more people understood. Every person you meet is carrying a story you can't see. The woman with scars. The man struggling to smile. The teenager who seems distant. The stranger sitting alone at a bar. We never really know what battles people have fought, what losses they've endured, or what victories they've earned. Sometimes the thing you're criticizing is actually evidence that someone survived something incredibly difficult. So if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: kindness costs nothing, assumptions cost everything, and the strongest people often look completely ordinary from the outside. Because the truth is, those reconstructed breasts weren't a sign of vanity. They were a sign of survival. And that's a story worth remembering.